It's fair to say that when the PS4 Pro was first announced, this is the feature that everyone was waiting for. I'm talking about Boost Mode, or Beast Mode, as it has become lovingly known around the internet. This is a brand new option buried under the system settings that has been quietly introduced in the latest beta version of the system firmware, version 4.50. The idea is simple. Boost Mode allows games released prior to the introduction of PS4 Pro to take advantage of the faster hardware without requiring an additional patch specifically enabling Pro support. This means games will look the same as before, but can potentially yield faster performance with this option enabled. So, just what does Boost Mode actually do then? To answer that question, let's ask our little buddy here. This is Knack. Knack runs with an unlocked frame rate on a standard PS4, a frame rate which isn't especially high or steady. And this is about what you can expect during normal gameplay, the baseline if you will. And this is Knack running with the PS4 Pro patch installed, a patch which enables support for higher frame rates, or higher resolution. In the high performance mode, the visuals are identical to the original PS4 release, but the average frame rate is substantially higher than before. Which begs the question, what happens if you run regular Knack without this patch while enabling Boost Mode? You get this instead, an average frame rate higher than the standard mode but still far south of the Pro patch. And at first glance it seems pretty cut and dried. The Pro version of Knack must be further optimized, right? Well, there might actually be more to this. When we put all three together, we see something interesting. Roughly a 14% increase in frame rate between base mode and boost mode. This is equivalent to the same 14% increase in GPU clock speed between the standard PS4 and the PS4 Pro. Our theory here is that boost mode simply bumps the clock speed of the GPU up to 911 MHz from 800 MHz. For games where the GPU is the limiting factor then, this is the kind of improvement we experienced during testing. Another example of this can be found here in Killzone Shadowfall, another PS4 launch game. Once again, we see a very similar difference between the base and boost mode here, which brings us to another theory. We might be seeing just one half of the GPU in action here, the second half used specifically for Pro-enabled games. This may actually be disabled in order to improve compatibility. This would suggest that we're just seeing a clock speed increase on half of the GPU. Now I must stress of course that this is just a theory, but it is something to think about. Now, from what we understand, Killzone and Knack are both GPU limited games, and the increase in performance falls directly in line with the clock speed boost on the GPU side. Neither of these games really come close to hitting or maintaining 60 frames per second during the single player portion, though Killzone does appear to play more smoothly in the multiplayer. It's difficult to get a like-for-like test here, but basically, Boost Mode does provide players with a generally more stable 60 frames per second in this mode, making it more pleasant to play. Okay, so we've seen what Boost Mode can do for GPU-limited titles, but what about those that rely more heavily on the CPU? A great example of this is Assassin's Creed Unity, a game which never ran especially well on a stock PS4 system. This is a game which is heavy on CPU usage, and by boosting the CPU clocks from 1.6 up to 2.13 GHz, we see transformative results. This increase in CPU speed is directly reflected in the game here. Walking through these crowds on a regular PS4 sees performance hang well below the 30 frames per second target, at almost all times. On the PS4 Pro with Boost Mode engaged, however, the frame rate is now almost completely stable. It's not 100% perfect, of course, but it's very close to hitting that locked 30 FPS mark. Assassin's Creed Unity now plays exactly how we would have liked in the first place. And despite its age, Unity is still an absolutely beautiful game, even at 900p. The lighting is superb here and the atmosphere is spot on. It's a lot easier to appreciate the impressive animation on display here with the higher frame rate as well. Boost Mode really is a game changer here in Unity, and if you haven't played it, it's now worth a look if you have a PS4 Pro. Oh, and how about this? Here's Unity running with Boost Mode enabled, but this time, we're looking at the original version of the game included on the disc with no patch installed. This is the original ultra buggy and broken version of Unity complete with its uncapped frame rate. This version never ran especially well on a standard PS4 mode, but with boost mode enabled, well, things actually wind up looking better than before. A lot better, actually. It's less fluid than the final patch version of the game due to the inherent judder here, but it's rather interesting to see how it runs in this non-patch state. Okay, so we've established that this is a pretty big deal then, but what about games that push the GPU and CPU in equal measures? Enter Project Cars. Yes, this infamous game has served us well as a benchmark thus far, with highly variable levels of performance based on the options selected. In this case, we've cranked everything up, including weather, to the absolute max, a scenario which absolutely murders the frame rate on a regular PS4. And, well, while we're still not at 60 frames per second here, the difference is pretty clear. Boost mode absolutely changes the game here, with dramatically smoother overall performance all around. This is the largest boost we've seen yet. While the increased CPU and GPU clock speeds are the main drivers here, the results in this case also lead us to believe that increased memory bandwidth might be playing a role as well. Basically, all of these elements are coming together to result in a game that runs so much better than before, and during the less demanding races, you can expect a pretty stable 60 frames per second. Alright, but how about a different kind of driving? I decided to jump back into Battlefield 4 and found a server with a full 64-player load, or at least close to it. I grabbed a buggy and took off down the ruined highway in search of frame rate drops, and for this test, I opted to do a couple of laps in this buggy through the busiest areas of the map. Both captures were played on the very same server within the same match. And while drops could at times be more severe than this on a regular PS4, this does give you a good idea of what you'll see during normal gameplay. And as with other tests, there's a pretty noticeable difference here. The base mode is dropping frames left and right, while the boost mode powers through without a hiccup. There isn't a single dropped frame on the boost side during this entire test. The difference in fluidity is clear as day, and Battlefield 4 becomes a much more playable experience as a result. It's really great to see launch titles such as this benefit so much from increased performance. While the player counts are not huge at this point given the age of the game, there were actually still plenty of people playing online, and you know what, revisiting on the Pro isn't a bad idea. Oh, and this is the most impressive example here actually. We see an advantage of almost 10 frames per second at points when using the boost mode, a tremendous achievement. And if you watch this entire sequence as I do a lap around the building here, you actually see that the base mode is suffering from drops throughout, while the Pro never drops a frame. Just beautiful. It would seem that Frostbite benefits greatly from increased CPU and GPU performance, as you might expect. But this isn't the only Frostbite game I tested. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is another one. This is a beautiful game, aside from its 900p resolution of course, and it was great to see DICE target 60 frames per second here. The results are not too far off most of the time, but there are a lot of small blips and drops present in the final PS4 version that keeps it from feeling completely smooth. When we enable boost mode, the situation is vastly improved. So it's not 100% perfect, of course, with small drops here and there, but the general experience basically feels like a locked 60 frames per second. The base mode, however, continues to exhibit pockets of slowdown throughout the experience, leading to the sensation that performance isn't quite where it should be. While I've given up hope of ever seeing a true pro patch for Catalyst, it is nice to see the game being enhanced by the PS4 boost mode. Between this and Battlefield 4, it's pretty clear that Frostbite games smoothly scale up on the hardware, which is great to see. Another interesting improvement is texture streaming. When using boost mode, textures appear to load quicker in a number of games. If I pause the action here, look closely at the building to the left. The textures remain blurry on the base side, but are fully loaded with boost enabled. A nice improvement indeed. We see the same thing over here on Battlefield 4. Look at the ground textures in this scene. Again, both of these captures were made right after loading into the game. Sony's statement on boost mode seems to suggest that loading can be improved, and this certainly seems to support that. Okay, so how about another interesting example then? Let's look at Tomb Raider: The Definitive Edition. This is one of the earliest PS4 game releases and also a pretty darn good port. The conversion was handled by Nixes, and the objective was to deliver enhanced visuals at a higher frame rate. Of course, what we're really looking at here is an uncapped frame rate that often dips into the 40s during gameplay. For such an early port, especially one with so many visual enhancements, it was only mildly disappointing at the time, but thanks to boost mode, we actually do end up seeing some pretty significant improvements here. Forest areas like this presented some performance issues for the original PS4 even without any action on screen at all. With boost mode, we generally see a 5 to 10 frames per second improvement when using that feature. A significant leap, I'd say. It would appear that, in scenes where the GPU is bottlenecking the system, the improvements are dropped to around the 14% mark again, but in other scenes the game definitely benefits more. Of course, Tomb Raider also highlights the one and only bug we encountered with the current beta version of the firmware. Regardless of the controller being used, the game would sometimes pause on its own, switch weapons, and generally act a little strange. This phantom input is slightly annoying for sure, and it occurred in both base and boost mode. It will be interesting to see if the problem is rectified when the final version of the firmware is released. Okay, so both Frostbite and the engine used by Tomb Raider benefit greatly from boost mode. We've established that much, but what about something else, like an older engine, but a very common one, Unreal Engine 3? I was pretty disappointed with the port of Bioshock Infinite to PS4 and Xbox One, but just as one would hope, boost mode is here to save the day. Soldier's Field really chugs at certain points when played using the standard PS4 mode, but these same sequences really come close to holding 60 frames per second when you enable boost. Again, it's not 100% perfect here, but it's a far cry from what we saw previously. Now, the game does still suffer from little hitches and skips at points, as I mentioned in the original coverage, but the frame rate at least remains much more consistent throughout, making for a pretty decent way to play Bioshock Infinite now. But how about a less popular and less optimized game, like Mighty No. 9, which also uses Unreal Engine 3? This is an infamous game, but it's also an interesting example. This entire highway stage here, for instance, struggles to hold 60 frames per second on a regular PS4 with near constant drops throughout. It feels downright unacceptable to encounter such an issue in a side-scrolling action game like this, which is why it's interesting to see just how much boost mode improves things. This stage now plays out as it originally should have. It adheres nicely to 60 frames per second rather than constantly dipping below. Seeing games like this benefit so much from boost mode is actually quite appealing, as it basically suggests that the feature can help clean up minor performance issues in a lot of games. So while games like Killzone and Tomb Raider never actually reach a sustained frame rate, smaller games like this can greatly benefit from the improvement. Games like this, Shantae Half Genie Hero. This just came out last December, and I'm a big fan of Shantae. I certainly enjoyed this latest installment after all, but at the same time I was also genuinely surprised to see certain stages suffer in terms of performance. As you can see, this particular stage just doesn't manage to hit 60 frames per second consistently in base mode. It really interferes with the sense of fluidity and speed you expect from the game. But then boost mode comes along and saves the day. These problems are completely eliminated, and the result is a game that operates at a rock solid 60 frames per second that we had hoped for in the first place. It really is a game changer here. Alright, I also had to try out something like Broforce, which ran pretty badly on a regular PS4, and unfortunately, even with boost mode enabled, this game just doesn't run very well at all. While there's probably an overall improvement here, it does kind of show that boost mode is not a magic bullet for unoptimized games. And there you have it, a whole slew of tests showcasing boost mode in action. Does it live up to expectations? Well, it depends on what you were expecting. It doesn't seem to unleash the full potential of the PS4 Pro, but it does make a huge difference with some games. This is exactly the kind of feature we wanted to see last November, and we are glad to see Sony pushing forward with such a feature now. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll be taking requests for other titles to test out in boost mode, so be sure to let us know in the comments or hit us up on Twitter with suggestions. We'll definitely be taking a look at games like Bloodborne and The Witcher 3, but you'll have to let us know what else you want to see going forward. That's all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, this is John signing off.